Hey everyone, it's me again. Welcome back to another episode of Physiology 2, especially for you. This video is all about blood pressure. Relatively short, but focused on blood pressure and the measurement of blood pressure. So let's have a look. Definitely in physiotherapy practice or in any medical situation, measuring blood pressure is quite common, relatively easy, but definitely essential. And for a physio, important to understand fully. So in this video, I'll try to explain the background of blood pressure, what determines blood pressure, how it's regulated, and how it is measured. So first, to understand the whole cycle and the differences in pressure that you can measure, we will look at this animation. So I'm just going to play it, and then you will see, hopefully in this video, a small green line passing from start to finish. And then the idea is that you should look at all the different events that are happening at the same time. This video is also available as a separate file on intranet, so I definitely encourage you to have a look at this video full screen in order to understand how all these different events are synchronized together. I'm just going to play this video, and then afterwards I will continue with my explanations. So what you see is that during the relaxation, during the contraction, you can see blood flowing in different directions. And then here in this graph, you can see the ECG, you can see the heart sounds, and you can see the pressure inside the different parts of the heart. So have a good look at this video, play it several times in order to fully understand the sequence of events and the pressure differences from one side to another. In this picture, you can see a little bit more large view of the same thing. So especially if you look at the different phases, try to see where valves open, where valves close because of pressure differences between aorta and ventricle or between atrium and ventricle, etc. So the ECG is there, the heart sounds is there, so everything is here in one overview. So it's a great image. Definitely practice until you can dream it. If you look at the pulmonary circulation, in contrast to the systemic circulation, then you can see that the pressure is a lot less. The flow, cardiac output, and the blood flow is the same, but the pressure on the right side is definitely less, and that's what you can see in this image right here. Here you see the pressure, and if you already know what the systemic blood pressure normal values are like, then you can see that definitely the pressure inside the pulmonary circulation is a lot lower than in the systemic circulation. But again, here it's all about pressure differences where you can see that the pressure on one side of the valve compared to the other will change here and will change there. So that will indicate a transition in the direction of blood flow and opening and closing of valves. Now, if you look at the systemic blood pressure measurements, then here's a nice animation that shows the methodology behind it. I'm just going to play this video and I want you to focus on the sounds because the whole idea is that sphygmomanometry, the measurement of blood pressure, is all about squeezing the artery completely until there's no blood flow and then gradually lowering the cuff pressure in order for blood to flow through only first at the peak, the systolic blood pressure, and then you will hear small bursts of blood flow when the blood pressure just exceeds the pressure in the cuff. So here you can see that here's the visualization of the cuff that can be inflated. So if you pay attention to what happens during the animation, then you will see that gradually the cuff pressure will be reduced. The sounds that you will hear will change, and that is something you could either detect and measure with a manual stethoscope method, or you do it with an automatic device, but the underlying principle is the same. Also, these automatic blood pressure devices will use this sound concept of detecting the peak pressure, the systolic pressure, and the diastolic pressure. I'm going to play this video, and then afterwards I'll explain with the next slide. Right, so now the cuff is going to be inflated. All right. So my question to you is to try and take a blood pressure machine or a stethoscope and try to measure your own blood pressure to see if you can get the concept and put it in practice. So here again, the idea is that you take the left arm. That's the standard approach in the standard protocol. You take the left arm and you make sure that your patient is completely relaxed, sitting in a chair with the arm actually supported in order for no muscle activity to be present that could, for example, impact the reading of the pressure. If you imagine if someone is moving his arm or he's talking or he's doing other movements, it might potentially create additional muscular pressure that will be added to the real blood pressure that you are trying to measure. So normally you want to make sure that your patient is seated with the arm rested on the table, for example, or on the arm rest. You position the cuff around the left arm, and then you make sure that you inflate the cuff to such a pressure that you completely close down the blood flow through the brachial artery. So once you have completely brought the pressure of the cuff above the pressure of the systolic blood pressure, for example, in this case, the 120 millimeters of mercury, you will hear nothing because there's no blood flow. And if there's no blood flow, there's no sound. So the idea is that after you've pushed the cuff pressure to a very high pressure, exceeding the systolic pressure, you gradually lower the pressure in the cuff by reducing the pressure here with that little device. And then as soon as you reach the peak pressure, the systolic pressure, you will have a burst, a small burst of blood flow at the point where the systolic pressure is reached, and you will have just a little bit, for a split second, you have blood flow through the cuff. But because of the very small and high resistance, very small diameter of the artery that is still present, you will have high resistance, which will cause turbulence, and that will cause this sound. If you then gradually lower the cuff pressure further, you will have a longer period of sound, because then here you can see that during this period the cuff pressure is lower than the actual blood pressure, so there will be blood flow, but because you're still squeezing the artery to some extent, you will have some turbulence and you will hear the sound until you reach the point where the pressure is almost to the diastolic pressure, which means that almost for the entire cycle, the blood will flow through the cuff, through the artery, because it's no longer so constricted, so compressed. So you will still have a sound, a small sound, until you go lower than the diastolic pressure. And if you can detect the moment where the sound is gone, you have detected the diastolic pressure. So the systolic pressure is basically when you first detect the sound after you've lowered the cuff pressure from the maximum just a little bit lower, and the diastolic pressure can be measured from the point where you change from sound to no sound, because that means you've reached the diastolic pressure. And then you see that in different guidelines or in different applications, sometimes different components of blood pressure are used. We can look at the systolic pressure. Like I said, that's the peak. We can look at the diastolic pressure, that is the minimum. But we can also look at the pulse pressure, which is basically the difference between the two. Or we could look at the mean arterial pressure, which is let's say, the mathematical average over time for diastolic and systolic pressure. If you look at this curve, then you can see here that the pressure curve is like this. Again, because the heart is a discontinuous pump, the pressure, especially in the bigger arteries, will also change according to this graph. So you will see the pressure rising until it reaches the systolic pressure, and then it will drop until the lowest point, the systolic pressure. Because the diastolic phase lasts longer than the systolic phase, the mean arterial pressure is not in the middle between the peak and the minimum, but is roughly here at 1/3 of that difference. So the pulse pressure is the difference between the two. The mean arterial pressure can be calculated by this formula, by just taking 1/3 of the pulse pressure on top of the diastolic blood pressure. What this graph then shows on top is that over time, over aging, what you expect is the blood pressure to increase, and that is especially true for the systolic pressure. So the systolic pressure of a 60-year-old person is expected to be higher than a 40-year-old person, and it is mainly attributed to a loss of elasticity. And the arteries, as the next slides will show you, are meant to buffer some of these pressure differences by their elasticity. And if that's lost or calcified for whatever reason, then you can expect the pressure to go up. So the mean arterial pressure, as you can see here, the mean pressure is 1/3 of this pulse pressure, and that is a value that also slightly increases as people grow older. So if you're using guidelines or if you're using measurements and you want to compare one person to another, please make sure to understand that the normal age-related values are definitely different if you compare a 20-year-old to a 60 or 80-year-old. Speaking about guidelines, hypertension is a very common disorder, especially in many countries where also obesity and other lifestyle-related issues are very prevalent. You see that hypertension is definitely a big risk factor for other issues with the cardiovascular system. So if the blood pressure is constantly high, it will cause the system to be constantly under a lot of stress. During exercise, it's not a problem as long as during rest, blood pressure will go down. But if already at rest, the pressure is high, on the long term, you can expect certain issues to be just more common because of the strain that the system will experience. What you see here is that the variation in pressure between, again, systolic and diastolic pressure is there for the systemic circulation, but also for the pulmonary circulation, but now nicely showing that the average here is obviously a lot higher in the systemic circulation compared to the pulmonary circulation, and that the pressure, if you get further into the system, will gradually lower towards zero. And if you look at the veins, the blood pressure that is left in the veins is close to zero, whereas the pressure just outside of the aorta is huge. Yeah, as mentioned before, the compliance of the arteries is very important to understand how blood pressure can be buffered and can be regulated. So as soon as the blood leaves the heart, especially if you would consider this to be the aorta, for example, you see that the elasticity of the bigger arteries is very important for the body to turn this discontinuous pumping action into a little bit more continuous pumping action. So in the point where the heart is relaxed, you would expect the elasticity to recoil, pushing blood again out, although the real pressure is gone. Whereas here in the systole, you would expect the elasticity to cause some of the buffering function in order for the pressure to not be huge, and the elasticity can then buffer a little bit, and that can then be returned by the elastic recoil during the diastolic phase. All right, and that was almost it, if not for this one. We will have a look at this animation, which is a beautiful animation that shows again all these different events synchronized in time. The official animation is available through the intranet or through the slide. So if you click the link, then you can open up this in your own browser. I definitely recommend you to do so because you can play around, you can see which events occur at which point, and you can just play it over and over again until you really get the full picture of the whole cardiac cycle. And that was it for another video. Thanks for watching. I hope you like it, and I hope to see you in the next video.